Buongiorno, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for a brief discussion about what it takes to develop a direct-to-consumer identity strategy. My name is Vittorio Bertocci. I work as a principal architect at Auth0, and I'm joined today by Sara Cecchetti.
Hello, everyone. I'm a principal product manager at AWS Identity. I'm so happy to be here at RSA today. And we are both in the chat answering questions if you have any questions while the presentation is going on.
Wonderful. All right. So without further ado, direct-to-consumer is an extraordinarily powerful strategy, really pays off. And so many companies today are considering approaching these and actually having their own services directly exposed to their intended audience, their customers, and in particular, consumers. However, this is tricky. It actually has a number of attention points that perhaps you should consider as you devise your strategy and your plan, your rollout. And so that's what we are going to talk about today in our very short presentation. And most of our advice can be summarized in 3 key takeaways. The first one is that although it's always the case that you need to find a balance between security and usability, this is especially true in the direct-to-consumer scenarios. Mostly because if you have a system which is too difficult to use, then people will not sign up and you'll have to close shop. This is not a matter of having your employees disgruntled because they cannot use the system efficiently. It's literally you want to make money. And on the other side, you are doing everything in the open, in very public settings. And so if something goes wrong, you might end up as a bad news in the first page of the New York Times. And so your security people will be very nervous. So finding the right balance between those two things is truly a critical aspect in this particular case. The other part is that you rarely get everything right at first take because there are just so many factors out there that you can do your best shot, but then you need to be prepared to measure how things work, how your audience is dealing with your system, and be prepared to adapt your strategy, and especially to respond to security issues. And then finally, don't believe the marketing from our companies is saying that it's just point and click and you'll be done. Technologies today are extraordinarily powerful. And if you are one of a few lucky people that are in the canonical quintessential scenario, yes, you might be able to adopt the technology and just use it as is out of the box. However, it's just going to be pretty hard to do if you wanted to customize, if you truly wanted to extract the value that is you are expected to get from your own, taking control of your own strategy. So without further ado, let me go a bit more into the details. In particular, the idea is that you need to find a balance between usability and security, as we mentioned, and so expect your head of growth to try to get your funnel as slippery as possible so that users can just find themselves in the system. They sign up very easily, and for them, the growth is the most important factor. But of course, on the other side, expect your security people to be extraordinarily nervous and try to have everyone do the moral equivalent of going to do groceries in a tank, mostly because everything is so public. And so if something goes wrong, not only is it really bad, because of course you are the custodian of important data, but also this can be an extinction level event for your company. So you'll have these very strong forces pulling you in 2 different directions. And how can you find this balance? Sarah will go into the details, but just to give you high-level views, probably a good point to start is with the data that you are trying to use, because mostly the data will determine the value of the things that you need to protect and the effort that you are expected to support. And here you might be surprised by how wide the category of personally identifiable information is. It's pretty much like almost everything. So if you sell clothes and if you're memorizing the size of your customers, that's PII. Of course, that's not the PII at the same level as payment instruments, for example, or genetic information of your customers. Personally, I never understood how those companies that deal with genetic testing, they don't force their customers to have a multi-factor authentication and similar. But that's just one example of a kind of disagreement you might find when you make these kind of evaluations. The other thing that is specific for the consumer scenario is the fact that you don't really choose your audience. If you are used to do identity systems for your employees, you might end up having things to the effect of, my employees are digitally competent. I hired them because of that kind of competency. But for customers, you don't really have control over the devices they have, the digital literacy you can expect, the level of patience that they have, the bandwidth, any disability that they might have. So the ability to understand what your audience can do and what is their level of tolerance is another factor that will play out really in a strong way as you devise your strategy in general. And then finally, the thing is that you don't necessarily need to have a monolithic strategy. Let's say that you can have different circumstances calling for different strategies. So you might decide that only certain operations require multi-factor authentication, or only certain circumstances, like the classic user accessing from a machine that is you have never seen. So in general, you need to factor in some flexibility so that when you do prompt, you prompt because you know that the counter value of not prompting wins against the security, the experience sacrifice that you're asking to your users. And it might sound difficult and overwhelming, but in fact, luckily, today's technologies are designed to help you make these kind of choices. And now I'd like to leave the floor to Sarah, who will dig deeper in this aspect.
Thanks, Vittorio. So I'm here to talk about some of the authentication tools that we can use in a direct-to-consumer identity strategy. I'm really passionate about authentication tools. This is actually my car. I think it's very important that people use multi-factor authentication. Yes, my car is dirty, I'm aware, but I put this picture in here because I wanted to talk about the F in multi-factor authentication. The specific factors that you use are really important. And when we say factors, what we mean is that usually we want to see two different things from three different categories. And those three categories are something you are, like a fingerprint or an iris scan, something you know, like a password, or something you have, like a phone or a YubiKey. When I log in, I use a YubiKey. I use YubiKey Nano 5s. I keep mine on my earrings so that I don't lose them. And so one of the things that people ask about consumer identity when we mention this idea of multi-factor authentication is, well, two of those aren't passwords. So is it possible that I can get away from passwords? Because I hate them. And it's true, consumers hate memorizing passwords and attackers love them. In fact, Alex Simon says the only people who love passwords are in fact attackers because they're easy to brute force. They're much easier to get around than a security key or a biometric. So the answer to the question, do we even need to have passwords, is complicated. It's true that local biometric and app-based authentication are easy and secure. The question is, does everyone have a smartphone with biometrics and at least an app? Is that assumption true? Let's dig into that data a little bit. Smartphone penetration by age is really interesting. If you're dealing with the 18 to 29 market, about 4% of them don't actually have a smartphone. When you get up to 30 to 49-year-olds, a full 8% of the market doesn't have a smartphone. So if your authentication is predicated on smartphone ownership, you're missing out on fully 8% of that market. If you go up to 50 to 64-year-olds, it goes up to 21%. And if you're dealing with the over 65 market, it's a full 47% that don't have smartphones. So keep that in mind as you are structuring your authentication strategy. You want to segment your market because some markets are more capable of having a secure and usable authentication strategy. Some of them you're going to have to go more toward the password area. So how do we, if we have to do passwords, how do we make them more secure and usable? How do we create a password policy that is both user-friendly and hard for attackers to guess? So the first thing we want to do is allow special characters. We want this password to be as complex as possible, to have a lot of entropy so that it has lots of different kinds of characters in it. It's not all lowercase characters. That would be very easy for an attacker to brute force. However, we don't want to require special characters and specific types of complexity. Here's what happens when we do that. If I'm an attacker and I'm trying to guess your password, here's all the things that I have to try. If I know that there's a capital letter in there somewhere, then I only have to try this many. And if I know that there's a number in there somewhere, then I only have to try this many. And so it actually reduces the space that they have to try in order to brute force or reverse a hash of a password. So while we do want to allow special characters, we don't want to require specific types of complexity. We do want to allow ridiculously long passwords. So a password like, "But soft what light through yonder window breaks, it is the east and Juliet is the sun." That's a Shakespeare line that a lot of people have memorized. That would make a very long, complex password. That has a ton more entropy than 9 ampersand 8 and capital O, right? Having very, very long passwords is actually the most secure way to make sure that you have a lot of entropy and that they're memorizable. And what that means is that you have to have spaces in there as well. And you should be storing those passwords in a way that's not plain text. So just in case you as an RSA attendee did not already know that, I hope you do now. Storage shouldn't be an issue for ridiculously long passwords. You should not force password rotation. This is guidance that has actually changed. Previously, we've said you should make people change their passwords about once a quarter in case that password gets compromised. But what we found since then is research shows that when you force people to change their password on a regular basis, they create passwords that are predictable and easy to guess. So they pick things like spring 2015 exclamation point, summer 2015 exclamation point. And those are very easy for attackers to guess. And so if a user can remember a long, complex password, for God's sake, let them keep it and let them use it. So what do we do to prevent against attackers getting access to that password? We compare it to a breach corpus. And a breach corpus is a list of username and password sets that we know to have been compromised. So if a user attempts to set a username and password that have already been compromised, we can say, you need to pick something else. That's a really bad idea. If you use that username and password, we know this account is going to get compromised. You'll have to go through an account recovery process, and that's going to be painful and expensive for everyone. And then what do we layer on top of a password? Well, most companies have MFA as optional, but they provide a lot of MFA options. So the most common one by far is SMS. It's not very secure. There are known vulnerabilities with SMS, including SIM swapping, but it is very easy to deploy. Even people who don't have smartphones can receive an SMS message and input a short code. We also see hardware keys, software applications, and platform biometrics. And obviously, you only want to use these MFA options or allow them if they're not already set as the first factor. We don't want two factors that are the same category. Another concern that a lot of people have about consumer identity is adaptive authentication. This is an interesting technology that lets us raise both the usability and the security bar at the same time. So the common implementation of adaptive authentication is that we're looking at the context of the authentication. So is the user coming in from a new IP address? Are they coming in from a new device? And we're using that to set the authentication ceremony and how complicated the authentication ceremony has to be. So just like Vittorio had that street with a lot of wines earlier, if somebody's coming in from a really risky IP address or a really risky device, we can say, okay, we're gonna put you through a lot of hoops before we let you log into this system. And on the other hand, if you're coming in from a device we recognize, an IP address we recognize, and a context we recognize, we might say, okay, we're just requiring your password, or we're just letting you into the application because you're probably you. In the future, there are interesting applications of adaptive authentication that I wanted to talk about as well. One of those is behavioral analytics. So some people obsessively check their email, check their Twitter, and they do so at the same times every day. And so we can get some read on whether this is the actual person or an attacker based on their activity. And this doesn't mean Big Brother. It doesn't mean we're sending all this activity up to the cloud. It means locally on the device, we can look at, is this person waking up at the normal time they wake up? Are they doing the normal things that they do? And use that as a factor to say, okay, do we need to re-authenticate? Do we not? Should we be using 2 factors or 1 factor? We can also look at passive biometrics, things like the accelerometer on the phone. Am I holding my phone the way I normally do? Is my voice the way it normally sounds? And we can also look at the sensitivity of what I'm trying to do. If I'm just checking a personal email inbox, maybe that's a lower security bar, versus if I'm making a change to a production system, that's a high security bar. And we may want to look at all of that authentication context and say, okay, if anything in there is risky, we really want 2 factors on this. But all of this is predicated on the idea that you are in control of the user's account, that the user actually has a row in your directory. And a lot of people say, well, that my users already have accounts somewhere else. They have accounts at Apple or at Facebook. And how complicated is it to log in from their social identity? It turns out it's really complicated. And Vittorio is going to explain it all to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Indeed, working with social connections is one of the classic things that look easy, and it is technically easy to set up, but it has some interesting implications that can come back to bite you if you didn't plan for that. One thing in particular is that when you have, it's very easy to have these this NASCAR page, as we like to call it, of providers, but having many of them is actually complicated. Like, you might think that you are offering to your user the opportunity to choose their favorite one. But the thing is that each of those providers will typically have its own interpretation of the standards. A lot of them actually don't support standards. Like Facebook, everyone likes to say that they support OpenID. They don't. They don't use OpenID Connect. They use something that smells like, but isn't exactly quite. And also very often they'll want you to use their own SDK. So one thing to consider is if you want to work with many different social providers, you might want to use an intermediary, both architecturally or as a service, so that you have at least one single place where you can handle relationships and you can handle change without impacting all of your apps. The other part is that security, of course, is very tricky. Like, all the things that Sarah described are predicated on the ability for you to control the account. And instead, in here, at least part of the authentication occurs elsewhere. And so the bar is set by someone else. Once again, if you have an intermediary, you can waive things that are in common across multiple providers, like, for example, a multi-factor authentication step after they come back from the provider. Another thing that happens all the time and people don't think about is sign-up amnesia. As in, if you have multiple choices when you sign up for a service, you might, of course, all of us have multiple social accounts, and so you might not remember which one you use for signing up. And so the outcome is that you sign up again. And when you sign up again, what happens is that now you might have multiple records. And so you, as the developer, you need to devise ways of potentially consolidating accounts without violating privacy. So that's another attention point that you might want to consider. And also, when you make signing up too easy, we'll see in a second that you might have other challenges. And then finally, one thing that you might want to consider, which really does happen, I promise you, if the ability for one user to access your application is predicated on their ability to access their social provider, now you are vulnerable to problems with that social provider. Let's say that if your user does something questionable that gets them banned from their identity provider, and if that identity provider is the only route you have for that user to reach your service, then you are in trouble, because now you cannot provide the service, and so you are probably not going to be paid as well. And that is a good segue for the next thing that I'd like to talk about, which is the account recovery aspect of the direct-to-consumer strategies. I'm sure you have seen this funny meme on the internet in which you have this truck that tries to retrieve a car that fell into the bay, but then unexpectedly the truck itself falls in the bay, and then they send a second truck to retrieve it, but for some reason, this truck also goes in the bay as well. So, of course, we don't want to plan for that many level of failures, although that's not necessarily bad. But the point here is whenever you have a strategy for sign up, sign in, and similar, make sure that you have a viable fallback, which is like, you might think it's obvious, but it isn't. Let's say that For example, here I have a flow that is a classic flow of a system that allow people to sign in using their device. So classic WebAuthn and device biometrics. In this flow, you can see in the first step that the first thing that the flow does is to ask the user to sign up to enroll using a different factor than their own device, so that we can now rely on that factor in case the device malfunctions, is stolen, is lost, and similar. You'd be surprised by how many people are enthusiastic about the ability to have people to just look at their phone and be signed in, and then basic hygiene, like making sure that you have a fallback actually get don't get enough attention. The other thing you might think about is that things change. Like people might have a certain email address available at sign up time, and then that email might no longer be accessible to them at the moment in which it's needed, when the account goes south. And this is exactly my own personal case. I was working for one company, and during that time, I signed up for a number of personal websites, services, and similar. And then once I left the company, that email was gone. Of course, I no longer have access to it. And now, years later, I still find places in which occasionally I have to reset my account, and turns out that my email is still the old one. And so I need to call them. So it's a pain. So make sure whenever you have an opportunity to interact with your user, to poke them and ask them, is this email still current? Is this phone number still current? And then finally, the one thing that you might want to consider is to have your security, the effort that someone needs to go through when they want to recover an account, to be higher than doing the sign-in. I'm sure that you have already experienced as a user the occasional application that you use once a year, the typical I'm filing my taxes. And so in that scenario, it's reasonable for people to just go and every time say, I don't have a password. Would be ideal if they wouldn't, if they are using a password manager, but it happens. But if your app is an app which is used often, then asking people to do a bit more effort for the account recovery is justified, because the account recovery is a moment in which an attacker potentially can legitimately cut out a legitimate user from the service. And so having a higher bar so that you discourage people from using the forgot password as a route for logging in is actually a good idea. And then biometrics, as I just hinted at the fact that you need special attention when it comes to recovery, because of course, if the biometric is on the device, if a device is gone, then you have a hard time retrieving it. But the other aspect is that the alternative, which is to have a biometric on the server, is a bad idea, because the biometrics cannot be revoked. And so the liability of keeping biometrics on the server side is pretty tough. But in order for you to make some of the decisions that I'm mentioning in here, you do need to measure how people are using the system, what's their level of tolerance, what are the routes that they follow. And so I'd like to once again give back the floor to Sarah, who will dig deeper into the measure and alarm aspect of solutions. Sarah?
Thanks. So one of the most complicated questions we get in consumer identity is, what should I measure? And first you want to take a step back and think about, why should I measure? It's actually expensive to instrument a lot of logging and make all that logging into graphs and dashboards. In order to figure out what you should measure, you have to figure out why you should measure. So public-facing identity systems are the most common target of attackers. This is the front door to your company. You want to make sure you're watching it closely. And real-life usability is very unpredictable. Where you think that text fields and buttons make complete sense to you, they make complete sense to your developers, I guarantee they're not going to make complete sense to all of your users. And the problem with that is not just that you're going to lose people during your sign-up process. The other problem is that people are going to have an incorrect mental model of what to put in those boxes. And this is very important in a consumer identity system because people are putting personally identifiable information in those boxes. They're creating passwords in those boxes. And so there is no security for those things without usability. If you don't have a good usability that has the correct mental model in the user's mind, there's a good chance that they're going to put the wrong thing in the wrong box, and you're going to end up with a situation where they're insecure. So instrument and collection for these things is not trivial, and you have to think quite a bit about it. First of all, you're collecting personally identifiable information and shared secrets like passwords. And you have to encrypt those things so that they don't end up in your logs, because your logs are looked at by your developers. Lots of people have access to them. You want to make sure that you are not divulging customer information there. You have to pay attention to who's going to look at it. A dashboard for a developer is going to look very different from a dashboard for an executive who's looking after the fact that, hey, there was an incident. What time did it start? What time did it end? How many people were affected? Those are two different methods of instrumentation. So it matters who your audience is. And what's the best way to visualize this? Sometimes it's a histogram, sometimes it's a line graph, oftentimes it's a map of where things are happening. So you have to consider that as well. And ultimately, what you're trying to get is taking things from information, from a row of just lines and numbers and letters, into knowledge, what happened in the system, into wisdom. What can we do about it? Who's attacking us? What do we do next? And this being a security conference, the main thing that we want to focus on instrumenting is finding out who attacks consumer identity systems and why. And the fact is that most people who attack consumer identity systems are very unsophisticated. They're looking for airline miles, they're looking for gift cards, and they do so in very predictable ways for the most part with off-the-shelf tools. So we can do some instrumentation to find these people. In order to detect these attacks, we're going to look for specific patterns. So during a password spraying attack, you're going to see a high volume of authentications with correct username and incorrect password. During a credential stuffing attack, you'll see a high volume of authentications again, but this time you'll see an incorrect username and an incorrect password. During a password phishing attack, you will see a correct username and password because the user's been phished, but what you're going to see is unusual behavior. So things like selling off airline miles or buying gift cards. And lastly, some vendors will aggregate insights from other companies and alert you if they see those same IP addresses or that same activity happening in your account. So if you have a vendor with multi-tenant capabilities, they may have a capacity that can do this for you. You need to alarm your identity flow funnels. When I say identity flow funnels, what I mean is that not all the people who start registration finish registration. Not all the people who start account recovery finish account recovery. However, there should be a predictable number of people falling off. And if you see that suddenly change, then you have a big problem. If you see a sudden drop off in people who try to recover their accounts and are successful at recovering their accounts, you may have a security issue, you may have a usability issue, you may have a technology issue. And so you need to page someone in to take a look at it immediately. You want to do this with your registration flows, your account recovery flows, your user editing flows, anything that involves editing directory information or signing up or deleting users. You also want to alarm on your API responses. So this is an example of a latency graph. And there's a red line here that says, okay, things are fine, things are fine, things are fine. This is where we want to page someone and make sure that they are looking at the system to find out what went wrong because something is taking too long. And where to put this line is very tricky, right? If you put it too high, you're going to have a lot of pager pain. And the people who are on call for you are going to be in the office a lot for no reason, and they're going to be complaining. Whereas if you put it too low, you're not going to catch a lot of the really severe incidents that are happening in your system. So there's a fine art as to where to put this line. But you do need to have it there. You need to have paging on your system to make sure you know if your APIs aren't responding in the way that you expect them to. But there is no substitute for a good identity team. If you take a look at that graph again, what would have happened if we had had small bits of latency that had never crossed that red line? It would be very obvious to a human that something's wrong with the system, something's going on. But unless someone is looking at it, no one will get paged, and so no one will know. The other thing to consider about a good identity team is that making one person look at that graph is not enough. It is human nature to look at a graph 99 times that has no problem with it, and then the 100th time say, yeah, I'm just not going to look at it today because it's probably fine. you need to have a mechanism where multiple people are looking at it. So bring it up at the beginning of your team meeting. Look at the dashboard for your service. Keep it up on a wall in a hallway. Make sure that people are looking at it on a regular basis, so that it's not just one person's responsibility to open it and take a look. So with that, here's a few things we want you to remember from the talk today. Security and usability must be balanced. You should measure and alarm and expect the unexpected. Identity systems are very unpredictable, as Vittorio and I can both attest. And expect and fund process and not magic checkboxes. You get what you pay for, both in terms of software and in terms of people. And we put together a list for you of action items you can take after our talk today to apply what you've learned in your workplace. So next week, you should identify stakeholders that can help with customer and data inquiries. In the first 3 months following this presentation, you should track down the kind of data you need to capture and through which lifecycle. Segment your target customers according to digital literacy, tolerance, how you can authenticate them, things like that. And then within 6 months, you should establish a data protection authentication experience strategy and start staging the work in release planning. So with that, thank you very much. You can find us both on Twitter. Please stay to fill out the speaker evaluations. We're also available for questions. We really appreciate being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.